The early morning fog rolled across Naval Base San Diego like a gray blanket, muffling the sounds of boots hitting pavement and commands echoing across training grounds. In the midst of this military precision, a small figure moved with deliberate purpose through the base's main gate, her visitor's badge barely visible against her modest cardigan. At exactly 0600 hours, Margaret Maggie Chen presented her credentials to the guard, who had to lean down slightly to check her ID. At 5 feet tall and 62 years old, she cut an unremarkable figure against the backdrop of America's elite warriors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Training Facility B, ma'am, the guard said, trying to hide his curiosity about why this diminutive grandmother was visiting the Navy SEAL training compound. Follow the yellow line, third building on your right. Maggie nodded, adjusting the simple canvas bag on her shoulder. Inside, among other items, rested a faded photograph of 6 young men in dress whites, their SEAL tridents gleaming in the California sun. One of those faces belonged to her late son, Lieutenant Commander David Chen, killed in action 3 years prior during a classified operation in Afghanistan. She wasn't here for revenge or closure. She was here because 6 active-duty SEALs had requested something unprecedented. They wanted to learn from the woman who had trained one of the most formidable operators in recent SEAL history. What they didn't know was that David Chen had learned everything from his mother, a woman whose past remained buried deeper than most state secrets. I wonder where you're watching this story from today. Perhaps you're in Virginia Beach, home to many of our nation's finest warriors. Or maybe you're in a small town in the heartland where American flags fly proudly from every porch. Wherever you are, you've probably formed an image of what a warrior looks like, tall and posing, muscled. But today's story will challenge everything you think you know about strength, about age, and about the packages that true power comes wrapped in. The legend of David Chen within the SEAL community. Certain names become legend. David Chen was one of those names. Despite standing only 5 feet 7, considered small for a SEAL, he had consistently outperformed operators who towered over him. His hand-to-hand combat skills were unmatched, his tactical thinking revolutionary. In training exercises, he could neutralize multiple opponents with an efficiency that seemed to defy physics. Chen had this way of moving, recalled Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, one of the 6 SEALs who had arranged this morning's unusual meeting. Like water flowing around rocks. You'd think you had him, and suddenly you'd be on the ground wondering what happened. The mystery deepened when, going through David's personal effects after his death, his team found training videos dating back to his childhood. In grainy home footage, a young David could be seen practicing complex martial arts forms under the watchful eye of a small woman, his mother. The techniques were unlike anything in standard military combatives training, blending elements that seemed both ancient and startlingly modern. Chief Petty Officer Jake Thompson had been the first to suggest reaching out to Maggie Chen. If she taught him everything he knew, maybe she could teach us something too, he'd argued. The others had been skeptical. How could a grandmother possess knowledge that could benefit Navy SEALs, warriors who represented the pinnacle of American military might? But as they dug deeper into David's background, they discovered gaps, periods of his mother's life that seemed to vanish into classified government files and redacted documents. Maggie Chen, it appeared, was more than just a grieving mother. She was a mystery wrapped in the unassuming package of a retired bookkeeper from San Francisco's Chinatown. First impressions, the 6 SEALs stood in a semicircle in Training Facility B, a sparse concrete building used for close-quarters combat training. They had arrived 30 minutes early, running through their own warm-up routines. Each man represented the peak of physical conditioning. Rodriguez at 6 feet 2 and 210 pounds of solid muscle. Thompson, slightly smaller but faster. Petty Officers Williams, Kowalski, Reeves, and Patterson, all between 5 feet 11 and 6'3", all capable of extraordinary feats of strength and endurance. When Maggie entered, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. She wore simple black exercise pants, soft-soled shoes, and a long-sleeved athletic shirt that seemed to swallow her small frame. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a practical bun. She moved with the careful steps of someone her age, nothing in her gait suggesting any particular athleticism. "Mrs. Chen," Rodriguez stepped forward, extending his hand. "We're honored you accepted our invitation." Maggie's handshake was firm but unremarkable. Her dark eyes swept across the group, taking in details with an intensity that momentarily reminded Rodriguez of her son's penetrating gaze. "My son spoke highly of all of you," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that placed her origins somewhere in southern China. He would be pleased to know his brothers wish to continue learning. Thompson cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we've all seen the training videos. David's skills were exceptional. We're hoping you might share some of the techniques you taught him." A small smile played at the corners of Maggie's mouth. "Techniques are just movements," she said, setting down her bag. David understood. Something more important. But perhaps a demonstration would be more useful than words. The SEALs exchanged glances. They had expected instruction, perhaps some historical context about the martial arts David had studied. They hadn't expected the grandmother to actually demonstrate anything physical. "Would one of you assist me?" Maggie asked, moving to the center of the training mat. Williams, the youngest of the group at 28, stepped forward. At 6'1" and 195 pounds, he was known for his speed and agility. He towered over Maggie by more than a foot. "What would you like me to do, ma'am?" he asked, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Attack me," Maggie said simply, "as you would any opponent." The room fell silent. Williams looked to Rodriguez for guidance, who nodded slowly. They had asked for this after all. "Ma'am, I don't think," Williams began. "Your hesitation is admirable, but misplaced," Maggie interrupted. "I'm not made of glass, young man. Your concern, while courteous, is based on assumptions. This is your first lesson." Hidden depths. Williams approached cautiously, reaching out with a standard control hold, the kind used to subdue without injury. His hand never made contact. Maggie shifted slightly, a movement so small it was barely perceptible, and Williams found himself grasping air. His momentum carried him forward, off balance. What happened next occurred in less than 2 seconds. Maggie's hand touched Williams' extended arm at 2 points, wrist and elbow. She stepped into his space, her shoulder barely grazing his chest. And suddenly Williams was airborne. He landed on the mat with a controlled thud, more surprised than hurt. The room erupted in surprised exclamations. Williams rolled to his feet, shaking his head in disbelief. What was that?" "Try again," Maggie suggested calmly. "This time don't hold back." Williams looked at his teammates, who nodded encouragement mixed with growing curiosity. This time, he approached with more purpose, attempting a faster grab. The result was the same, a subtle redirect, a precise application of leverage, and Williams found himself on the mat again. "Newton's third law," Maggie explained as Williams stood. "Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. But most people only think in straight lines." David understood that force can be circular, that strength can be borrowed rather than opposed. Kowalski stepped onto the mat. "May I try, ma'am?" Over the next several minutes, each SEAL took turns attempting to grab, hold, or otherwise control the small grandmother. Each attempt ended the same way, with elite warriors finding themselves gently but firmly deposited on the training mat. What struck them wasn't just the effectiveness of her movements, but their efficiency. Where they would use strength, she used angle and timing. Where they would resist, she would yield and redirect. "This is impossible," Patterson muttered after. His third unsuccessful attempt. "You're not even breathing hard, because I'm not fighting," Maggie replied. "Fighting requires effort. I'm simply occupying the space you're trying to control and helping you continue in the direction you've already chosen." Rodriguez, who had been observing carefully, noticed something the others had missed. Every time one of them moved to attack, Maggie's position shifted almost imperceptibly before they even began their motion. She was reading their intentions, their muscle tension, their weight distribution, and moving accordingly. "You're anticipating us," he said. Maggie nodded approvingly. "The body speaks before the mind acts." David called it listening with your skin. Every attack begins with preparation, a shift in weight, a change in breathing, a tensing of specific muscles. By the time your conscious mind has decided to act, your body has already announced its intentions. The origin story: the SEALs sat in a circle on the mat, their initial skepticism replaced by genuine interest. Maggie settled into a cross-legged position with a flexibility that belied her age. "You want to know how I learned these things?" she said. It wasn't a question. The story begins long before David was born, in a village in Guangdong province that no longer exists. She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "My grandfather was what you might call a traditional martial arts master, though he would have laughed at such a title. He was simply a farmer who understood that, in uncertain times, one must be prepared to protect family and community. The art he practiced had no name, it was just the way we move in our village. When the Japanese invaded in 1937, my grandfather's knowledge became more than tradition, it became survival. He taught the villagers, especially the women and elderly who couldn't flee, how to defend themselves against soldiers. Not through strength, but through understanding." Thompson leaned forward. "Understanding what exactly?" "That every strength contains weakness," Maggie replied. "That every attack creates vulnerability. That the most dangerous opponent is often the one who appears least threatening. The Japanese soldiers expected resistance to look like opposition. They didn't expect it to look like acceptance that transformed into redirection." She continued, "After the war, my grandfather's teachings were nearly lost. The new government frowned upon traditional martial arts, seeing them as feudal relics. But in our family, the knowledge passed quietly from generation to generation. My father taught me, beginning when I was 4 years old. Not as fighting, never as fighting, but as a way of moving through the world with awareness and intention. By the time I was David's age," she smiled at the memory, "I could walk through a crowded market without touching a single person, no matter how packed it was. I could sense the intentions of pickpockets before they acted. These weren't supernatural abilities. They were simply the result of decades of training and awareness." The SEALs absorbed this information, beginning to understand that Maggie Chen's abilities weren't random or mystical. They were the product of systematic training stretching back generations, refined through practical application and survival necessity. Coming to America. "I came to America in 1979, Maggie continued. "The China I left behind was still recovering from the Cultural Revolution. I was 23, newly married, carrying everything I owned in a single suitcase. My husband found work in a restaurant in San Francisco. I took English classes during the day and cleaned offices at night." "But you kept training," Rodriguez guessed. "Every morning at 4 a.m., Maggie confirmed. "In our tiny apartment's living room, with furniture pushed against the walls. My husband thought I was crazy, waking so early to practice movements from a world we'd left behind. But I couldn't abandon my grandfather's legacy. It was all I had left of home. When David was born in 1985, I faced a choice. We were Americans now. Did I burden him with traditions from a village that no longer existed? Or did I let him grow up as just another American kid?" She looked at each of the SEALs in turn. "I chose both. David played Little League and studied Kung Fu. He went to public school, and learned forms that predated the founding of this nation. He lived in two worlds, and that duality made him stronger. The training videos you found, those were just fragments. For every hour you saw, there were hundreds unseen. David didn't just learn techniques. He learned to see movement as language, to read bodies like books, to understand that true strength comes not from domination, but from harmony with natural forces. William, still processing his repeated trips to the mat, asked, "But how does this translate to combat?" SEALs aren't trying to redirect energy in a firefight. Maggie stood smoothly, again displaying surprising agility. "Aren't you? When you clear a room, do you fight the geometry or use it? When you move through hostile territory, do you oppose the terrain or flow with it?" Combat, at its essence, is about controlling space and time. The principles remain constant whether you're using firearms or empty hands. She walked to her bag and removed the photograph of the 6 SEALs with David. My son understood this. It's why he could enter a room and instantly know where every threat would come from. Why he could move through a crowd and identify the one person who didn't belong. He didn't just train his body, he trained his perception. The challenge as the morning progressed, Maggie led the SEALs through basic exercises that seemed deceptively simple. Standing meditation to develop awareness of their own bodies. Slow, walking patterns that required precise control of weight distribution. Partner drills that emphasized sensing, intention rather than reacting to movement. For men accustomed to high-intensity training, the slow, focused work was surprisingly challenging. Muscles used to explosive action trembled with the effort of controlled, deliberate movement. Minds trained for rapid tactical assessment struggled with the subtlety of feeling another person's balance through a light touch. "This is harder than Hell Week," Patterson joked, sweat beading on his forehead from the effort of maintaining a seemingly simple stance. "Different kind of difficult," Maggie agreed. "You've trained to overcome opposition through superior conditioning. And will, this training is about becoming so sensitive that opposition becomes unnecessary." As noon approached, Rodriguez called for a break. The SEALs gathered around a water cooler, discussing what they'd experienced in lowered voices. "I've studied martial arts for 15 years, Townsend said. Jiu-jitsu, Krav Maga, military combatives. This is unlike anything I've encountered." "It's like she's not even there," Williams added. "You go to grab her, and it's like trying to hold smoke." Kowalski, who had remained relatively quiet, voiced what they were all thinking. If a 62-year-old grandmother can do this to us, what else don't we know about combat? Rodriguez made a decision. "Mrs. Chen," he called out. "We'd like to propose something. Would you consider working with us on a more regular basis? Not to replace our current training, but to supplement it with these principles?" Maggie considered the request. "I'm honored by your interest. But understand, this isn't a quick study. David trained for over 20 years to reach his level of skill. Even learning the basics properly takes months of dedicated practice." "We're SEALs, ma'am," Townsend said with a grin. "We're pretty good with dedicated practice." A genuine smile crossed Maggie's face. "Very well. But I have conditions. First, you must understand that this knowledge comes with responsibility. It's not for sport or show. Second, you must be patient. Your bodies are strong, but your sensitivity is underdeveloped. We must build from the ground up." "And third?" Rodriguez asked. "Third," Maggie said, her expression becoming serious, "you must be prepared to question everything you think you know about strength and weakness, about age and youth, about what a warrior looks like." My son understood that the most dangerous person in a room is rarely the one who looks most threatening. Can you accept that? The 6 SEALs exchanged glances, then nodded almost in unison. They had come seeking techniques to add to their arsenal. They were beginning to realize they might have found something far more valuable, a completely different way of understanding combat itself. As the fog burned off outside, revealing the sprawling naval base in all its military might and unusual. Partnership was forming in training facility. B6 of America's elite warriors were placing themselves under the tutelage of a small grandmother whose power came not from muscle or youth, but from generations of accumulated wisdom about the true nature of conflict. The real test, however, was yet to come. Because Maggie Chen hadn't revealed the full extent of her capabilities, and the SEALs hadn't yet understood just how much they had to learn. The morning's gentle demonstrations had been merely an introduction, a whisper of possibility. Soon, they would discover why David Chen had once told his teammates, with complete seriousness, that his mother was the most dangerous person he'd ever met. Not because she could fight, but because she had transcended the very need to fight while retaining the ability to end any confrontation before it truly began. The journey into this ancient wisdom was just beginning, and it would challenge everything. These modern warriors believed about combat, strength, and the nature of true martial prowess. In a world of high-tech warfare and sophisticated weapons, they were about to learn that the most powerful weapon remained what it had always been: a properly trained human being who understood the deepest principles of movement, intention, and control. 3 weeks had passed since that first morning in training. Facility B, the 6 SEALs had integrated Maggie's training into their routine, meeting with her every Tuesday and Thursday at 05:00 hours. Progress was slow but noticeable. They were beginning to sense the subtle shifts in weight that preceded movement, to feel the intention behind a touch. But they were still thinking too much, trying to intellectualize what needed to be felt. On this particular Thursday, Maggie arrived with an unusual companion, Master Sergeant Janet Riley, from the Marine Corps' martial arts program. Riley, a compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and calloused hands, had driven down from Camp Pendleton at Maggie's invitation. "Gentlemen," Maggie said after introductions, "Sergeant Riley trained with David during a joint operation in 2018. She's one of the few people who've experienced the full application of our family's art in a combat situation." Riley's expression was serious as she addressed the SEALs. "What Mrs. Chen has been teaching you, the sensitivity, the redirection, it's just the foundation. I'm here to tell you what happens when those principles are applied with intent." She pulled out a tablet and showed them security footage from a training exercise. This was a hostage rescue simulation. 6 Marines playing hostiles, all trained in close combat. David was supposed to clear them using non-lethal force. The grainy footage showed David Chen entering a room where 6 Marines waited in ambush positions. What followed lasted exactly 12 seconds. David moved through the space like water, finding its path downhill, never stopping, never struggling. Each Marine who engaged him seemed to simply fall away, their own momentum used against them. Within those 12 seconds, all 6 were on the ground, incapacitated but unharmed. "We reviewed this footage frame by frame," Riley continued. "He made contact with each hostile for less than half a second. No strikes, no holds, just precise application of force at exact angles that shut down their ability to continue fighting." Thompson whistled low. "That's incredible." "But he was special operations, trained for years." "That's what I thought too," Riley interrupted. "Until I met his mother." The full demonstration, Maggie stood in the center of the mat, her usual calm demeanor unchanged. "Sergeant Riley has asked me to demonstrate the combat applications of what you've been learning. I've been hesitant because without the foundational understanding, these techniques can be dangerous to both the practitioner and the opponent." Rodriguez stepped forward. "Ma'am, we've all signed waivers. And frankly, we need to understand what we're working toward." Maggie considered this, then nodded. "Very well. But we'll use safety protocols. Attack intention only, pull your strikes just before contact. I'll demonstrate control, not damage." The 6 SEALs spread out around the mat's perimeter. They had sparred together countless times, understood each other's rhythms and patterns. They'd taken down hostile forces around the world, worked as a unit with lethal efficiency. "Sergeant Riley will call the engagement," Maggie said, settling into a neutral stance that looked almost casual. "Gentlemen, your objective is simple: restrain me by any means necessary." Williams and Patterson exchanged glances. Even after weeks of training, the idea of 6 elite warriors attempting to subdue a 5-foot grandmother seemed absurd. But they'd learned to set aside such assumptions. "Ready positions," Riley called out. The SEALs shifted into combat stances, creating a circle with Maggie at its center. "Remember, this is a training exercise. Safety first, but don't hold back your intent. Begin." Kowalski moved first, approaching from Maggie's left with a low tackle attempt, a wrestling move that had served him well in countless engagements. Thompson came from the right, timing his approach to coincide with Kowalski's. Rodriguez and Williams moved to cut off escape routes while Patterson and Reeves prepared to support. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed. For months afterward, Maggie didn't retreat or advance. She simply pivoted, a small adjustment that put Kowalski's trajectory on a collision course with Thompson's knee. As Kowalski instinctively pulled up to avoid the collision, Maggie's hand touched his shoulder, a whisper of contact that somehow redirected all his momentum upward and back. He crashed into Patterson, who was moving to support. Thompson, committed to his angle of attack, found Maggie no longer where she'd been. Her position had shifted by inches, but those inches placed her inside his guard. A touch to his inner elbow, another to his hip, and Thompson's body betrayed him. Folding into a controlled fall that tangled Reeves' legs, Rodriguez and Williams, recognizing the chaos, coordinated their approach with hand signals. They came in high and low, a classic military room-clearing technique adapted for hand-to-hand combat. Maggie flowed between them like smoke through grasping fingers. Williams' high grab became a gift of momentum that she redirected into Rodriguez's solar plexus. Rodriguez's low attack met nothing but air as Maggie stepped through a gap that shouldn't have existed. In 12 seconds, it was over. 6 Navy SEALs lay on the mat in various states of disarray, not injured, barely touched but thoroughly neutralized. Maggie stood in the center, her breathing unchanged. A slight sheen of perspiration, the only sign of exertion. The training facility fell silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing from the mat. Understanding the impossible. How? Williams gasped, pulling himself to a sitting position. "We had every angle covered." Maggie helped Thompson to his feet. "You had every angle you could see covered." But combat geometry isn't just about physical space, it's about time, intention, and possibility. You were fighting the battle that existed in your minds. I was moving through the battle that actually was. Riley stepped onto the mat. "What you just experienced is what David called ghost walking. It's not about being faster or stronger. It's about existing in the spaces between intentions, moving where force hasn't yet arrived." Rodriguez rubbed his solar plexus, still catching his breath. But the precision required to redirect 6 simultaneous attacks without causing serious injury took me 40 years to develop, Maggie admitted. David reached this level in 25. You're asking to learn in weeks what takes decades to master. But why haven't we seen this before? Patterson asked. If this art is so effective, why isn't it taught everywhere? Maggie sat down, gesturing for them to join her. Because it can't be mass-produced. Modern military training needs techniques that can be taught to thousands, that work with aggression and adrenaline. This art requires calmness and chaos, sensitivity and violence. It's antithetical to how most warriors are trained. My grandfather used to say, you can teach 1,000 soldiers to thrust a spear, but you can only teach one student to become the spear. This isn't about techniques you can drill. It's about fundamentally changing how you perceive and interact with conflict. Thompson, always the most technically minded, pressed further. But there must be principles we can extract. concepts we can apply to modern combat. There are, Maggie. Agreed. First, every attack creates a void where the attacker was. Second, force committed in one direction cannot instantly change to another. Third, the body's structure has inherent weaknesses that no amount of strength can overcome. Fourth, intention precedes action by milliseconds, but those milliseconds are enough if you're sensitive enough to feel them. She demonstrated with Williams, having him push against her palm. Feel how your body organizes itself to generate force. Shoulder engages, hip turns, foot presses into ground. Now, she shifted slightly, and Williams stumbled forward. I didn't. Oppose your force. I removed what it was pushing against at the moment your body committed to the push. The deeper truth as the SEALs processed what they'd experienced, Kowalski asked the question that had been forming in all their minds. Mrs. Chen, who are you really? This level of skill, this knowledge, it doesn't come from just family tradition. Maggie was quiet for a long moment. Riley looked like she wanted to speak but held back. Finally, Maggie said, in 1989, I was recruited by an organization that doesn't officially exist. They were interested in my family's art for its intelligence applications, the ability to move through crowds undetected, to neutralize threats without leaving evidence of struggle, to read intentions before they became actions. The SEALs leaned, in recognizing they were hearing something few people knew. For 15 years, I served in capacities I still can't discuss. David never knew the full extent, though he suspected. When he joined the Navy, I retired completely, became the bookkeeper. And grandmother everyone saw, but the skills, those never leave. That's why David's records have gaps, Rodriguez said, understanding dawning. His mother had a classified background. Which is why, Riley added, certain people very high up the chain of command approved this training when Captain Rodriguez requested it. They remembered Maggie Chen, even if the official records don't. The weight of this revelation settled over the group. They weren't just learning from a martial arts master. They were learning from someone who had operated at the highest levels of clandestine service. The real lesson, but here's what matters, Maggie said, bringing focus back to the present. David understood something in his final years that took me decades longer to grasp. The greatest strength of this art isn't in combat, it's in avoiding combat entirely. She pulled out a letter worn from handling. He wrote this before his last deployment. May I? The SEALs nodded. Mom, she read, I finally understood what you and grandfather were trying to teach. It's not about winning fights, it's about moving through the world so aware, so sensitive to the currents of intention and possibility, that conflicts resolve before they begin. Every technique you taught me is really about connection, feeling so deeply into a situation that the path of least harm becomes clear. I've saved more lives through understanding than I ever did through force. Her voice caught slightly, but she continued, if anything happens to me, please keep teaching. Not to create fighters, but to create warriors who understand that true strength lies in knowing when not to fight. The training facility was silent as she folded the letter. The decision, Rodriguez spoke for the group. We want to continue learning, Mrs. Chen, not just the combat applications, but all of it, the perception, the sensitivity, the philosophy. It will change how you see your profession, Maggie warned. David struggled with this. How do you train for violence while cultivating nonviolence? How do you prepare for war while seeking peace? Maybe that's exactly what we need to figure out, Thompson said. We're the tip of the spear, but maybe we need to be more surgical about how we use that edge. Over the next hour, they discussed how to integrate this training more deeply into their routines. Riley offered to coordinate with Marine units that had worked with David. Plans were made for extended training sessions, for bringing in other instructors who had preserved similar arts. As the session concluded, Williams asked one final question. Mrs. Chen, that 12-second demonstration, were you really trying? A small smile played at her lips. "Young man, if I had been really trying, it would have been over in 4 seconds. But where's the teaching in that?" The legacy continues. 6 months later, the integration of Maggie's teachings had spread quietly through special operations communities. Not as a replacement for existing combatives, but as an enhancement, a way of perceiving and moving that made elite warriors even more effective. Rodriguez led a demonstration for visiting brass, showing how the principles of sensitivity and redirection could be applied to everything from room clearing to crowd control. The visitors were skeptical until Rodriguez, using only the lightest touches, guided a fully resistant opponent through a series of movements that ended with the man on the ground, confused but unharmed. "The credit goes to Mrs. Chen," Rodriguez explained. "She taught us that true mastery isn't about dominating opponents. It's about understanding movement so deeply that conflict becomes a dance where you always lead." In a small office overlooking the demonstration, Maggie watched with Riley. "David would be proud," Riley said. "He is," Maggie replied softly. "Every time one of these warriors chooses understanding over force, chooses precision over power, David's legacy lives on." Epilogue: The Ripple Effect, the story of the 5-foot grandmother who could neutralize 6 Navy SEALs in 12 seconds became legend in special operations circles. But those who knew the truth understood it differently. It wasn't about an elderly woman defeating elite warriors. It was about the humility of those warriors to learn from someone they might have dismissed. About the courage to question their own assumptions about strength and power. Maggie continued teaching, splitting her time between military installations and community centers where she taught simplified versions to civilians, especially women and elderly people who needed effective self-defense that didn't rely on physical strength. The 6 SEALs became her most dedicated students and eventually teachers themselves, passing on not just techniques but a philosophy that true warriors seek to end conflicts, not win them. That sensitivity is not weakness, but the highest form of strength. That an open hand can be more powerful than a closed fist. On the first anniversary of that initial demonstration, the SEALs presented Maggie with a plaque. It read simply, "To Sifu Chen, who taught us that the greatest victory is the battle that never needs to be fought." Standing there in Training Facility B, surrounded by some of America's most elite warriors, Maggie thought of her grandfather in that vanished village, of her son who had carried the knowledge forward, and of all the future students who would learn that true power comes not from youth or size or strength, but from understanding the deepest principles of human movement and intention. The art would continue, adapted for a new age but rooted in ancient wisdom. And somewhere, she was certain, her grandfather and her son were smiling. In a world that often equated might with right, a small grandmother had reminded elite warriors that the most profound strength often comes in the gentlest packages, that the most dangerous person in a room might be the one who appears least threatening, and that true mastery lies not in the ability to defeat others, but in the wisdom to make defeat unnecessary. The lesson would ripple outward, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen. Proof that one person, no matter how unlikely, can change how others see the world, if they're willing to look beyond appearances and learn. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.